Here. Sorry, a couple of minutes late, but we do have something really interesting to show here. This is committee today. I haven't had a chance to watch it yet myself, but I've heard that it was very exciting, so we're gonna jump in.
Ogo, we appreciate you coming on relatively short notice. We look forward to hearing from you. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Je remercie le président et les membres du comité.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee, for inviting me here today. My name is Alexander Ziglich, and I appreciate the opportunity to appear again before this committee to shed a light on the findings of my office's recent report on procurement practices of contracts awarded to McKenzie and Company.
Mercereau, Director of Inquiries, Quality Assurance, and Risk Management. Mon bureau est indépendant des autres.
My office is independent of other federal organizations, including Public Service and Procurement Canada. I submit an annual report to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, but the Minister has no influence over the results of my reviews or reports, and all my activities are conducted at arm's length from PSPC and other federal organizations.
Independent organization, my legislative mandate includes the review of procurement practices of federal departments to assess fairness, openness, and transparency and consistency with laws, policies, and guidelines, which is what we're here to discuss today. On February 3rd, 2023, the Minister of Public Services and Procurement requested that I conduct a review looking into contracts awarded to McKenzie and Company. Once my office was able to establish reasonable grounds as per our regulatory requirements, the review was launched on March 16, 2023. As per our legislative deadline, my office completed the review of McKenzie contracts on March 15, 2024, and the report was published on our website on April 15, 2024. My office examined the procurement files of 32 McKenzie contracts and one National Master Standing Offer, or NMSO, issued to McKenzie through competitive and non-competitive procurement processes to assess their fairness, openness, and transparency and their compliance with legislation, regulation, policy, and procedural requirements. PSPC was the contracting department for 23 contracts and the National Master Standing Offer. The review did not include contracts awarded by federal organizations that are not in my mandate, for example, contracts awarded to McKenzie by Crown corporations. With regards to competitive procurement practices leading to the award of contracts, my office identified instances where procurement strategies were changed to allow for McKenzie's participation in the procurement process, creating a perception of favoritism towards McKenzie. We also observed deficiencies related to bid evaluations in multiple files, including missing or incomplete documentation, failure to conduct evaluations as per planned approach, and the inappropriate reevaluation of bids, leading to McKenzie being deemed the only compliant bid. My office also identified shortfalls related to personal security clearances, including lack of documentation to show that security clearances of proposed resources were verified before they were authorized to work, or to confirm that contracts were sent to PSPC's contract security program when required. With regards to non-competitive procurement practices leading to the award of contracts, my review found that the sole source justification used by PSPC to establish the McKenzie Benchmarking Services NMSO did not contain the required information needed to justify this sole source standing offer. 19 contracts known as call-ups with a total value of almost $49 million were issued to McKenzie without competition against this standing offer. We also found that the vast majority of call-ups issued against the McKenzie Benchmarking Services NMSO were void of any description of the specific work to be carried out by McKenzie and, by extension, proper PSPC oversight. In these files, there was no evidence on file that a statement of work had been developed in advance of determining the procurement strategy or contacting McKenzie with the requirement. In these cases, it was impossible for my office to determine the extent to which McKenzie defined the requirement for these departments, which is a serious threat to the fairness of the procurement process. All call-ups issued against the McKenzie Benchmarking Services NMSO were non-competitive. The majority of these call-ups also lacked sole source justifications. Sole source justifications were never sought by PSPC in its capacity as the contracting department. In total, 18 of the 19 competitive call-ups were awarded by PSPC in the absence of justification on file. We also noted conflicting information regarding the use of McKenzie benchmarking services NMSO for call-ups with security requirements. My office also examined practices for issuing contract amendments and task authorizations for McKenzie. Overall, contract amendments were appropriate and were in line with policy and guidelines, but several issues were noted, including an instance where the contract amendment was not on file, an instance where the contract amendment was not issued prior to contract expiry, and an instance where the call-up was amended to increase the value by nearly $2 million without a clear description of the changes to the scope of work. We also examined practices related to disclosure of contract awards. In most instances, necessary disclosures were made on the proactive disclosure website. However, we noted issues with respect to the accuracy of information. In total, there were 5 recommendations made by my office, which were all accepted by the implicated departments. It should also be noted that PSPC accepted most of the findings in the report but took issue with some observations. I would be pleased to discuss all of these matters with you. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thanks for your attention. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Now with Mrs. Goosey for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Yagluk and Monsieur Mercenot, for being with us here again today. I see that the 4 lines of inquiry, the first one being competitive procurement practices leading to contracts awarded to McKenzie, yet 78% of McKenzie contracts were sole sourced, and 59% of the contracts you reviewed were sole source contracts specifically under a benchmarking service deal catered towards McKenzie, correct?
Can't validate the statistics, but yes, it sounds accurate.
Thank you. So this specific benchmarking solution was originally valued at $47 million, but then increased to $48.8 million. And only one contract of the 19 provided any justification as to why McKenzie was the only company able to perform the necessary services. So this means $43 million was paid to McKenzie without the proper documentation, a theme we've seen repeatedly, unfortunately, across this government. Do you believe it's because the departments favor McKenzie as a company in comparison to others that perform similar services?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I think in totality what we concluded, in addition to the NMSO, which you well described, we found instances of favoritism towards McKenzie. Now, the one counter to that is in the NMSO creation, as we reported in the report, there was also the creation of 4 other national master standing offers with other entities, not McKenzie.
So then why do you think it was that departments were changing their requirements to allow for McKenzie to bid on contracts that they were not originally eligible for?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So again, where there's a lack of documentation, we simply allege the facts, right? And I don't know if you recall, but at my previous testimony, I started to talk about negative inferences. At what point do we make negative inferences associated with the lack of documentation? And this report starts that trend of negative inferences where we allege the facts, but ultimately came to a conclusion that in sum, there was favoritism towards McKenzie.
And what evidence did you find that encouraged this favoritism from government departments?
Well, so you've cited 2 examples. So one was in the change of procurement strategy. What we saw was there was a procurement strategy being contemplated, and then it was only through the realization, whether it be directly with McKenzie or through the contracting authority, that they would not be qualified to participate in the process, and therefore there was a reconsideration of the process. Now, could there have been additional factors in addition to that fact alone? Absolutely. And we're not discounting that, but we're simply saying that did happen, and the contracts were in fact awarded to McKenzie. And I just will say one more thing. In addition, we found a lack of documentation. So other ways that we could kind of walk back our findings, where if we saw documentation which would explain why some of these decisions were taken. And you'll note in the report there was a lack of information explaining why there was a change of these decisions or procurement strategies.
Yeah, interesting, very similar to the Auditor General's findings around ArriveCan, that she was unable to actually determine the actual cost of ArriveCan as a result of missing documentation. The only contract that received a justification was challenged by PSPC. I believe the term that they used specifically was take issue. Words were take issue, because it was not accurate and did not justify the exception. Did ESDC respond with the proper justification, or did they maintain their original justification?
The justification that's cited in the report is the only one we saw. We didn't see a subsequent, that might have been previously adjusted, but what we saw in the file is what's reflected in the report, and it provided inadequate justification in our view.
Thank you. To approve the contracts, PSPC had the Minister of Procurement personally sign off on this $5.7 million contract. Is that correct?
Yes.
Which minister signed off on this contract?
Minister Tassi.
Thank you. Is it standard practice for a minister to personally approve a contract that their own officials challenge?
So in this circumstance, we did look for the rationale as to why the minister signed off on this specific contract. So there is an internal delegation instrument, I believe, within the department that, based on the dollar value associated with the contract, required minister approval.
What justification would a minister possibly use or to have to sign off on a $5.7 million contract? Can you think of a justification that would be legitimate for where a minister could personally override their officials and sign off on a contract? Have you seen this before? And what would, if not, yes, when? And if not, what kind of justification could possibly be used for this type of authority?
So I will say the implication of any political actor in a procurement process is not ideal, because it puts the political actor in a difficult position, whether approval or rejection of the recommendation to ultimately enter into the contract. That being said, the signature was provided based on the recommendation, and it was in line with the required delegations within the department. Beyond that, we have no additional insight specifically why that was done other than the value of the contract.
Thank you, Mr. Yeglick. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, both of you. Ms. Outman, please, for 6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witness for being with us. So I'm kind of new again to this conversation, so I have a lot of background questions, so forgive me. So first I'd like to start with the Task and Solutions Professional Services, so TSPS, consists of two supply arrangements, one for task-based requirements and the other for solution-based requirements. Can you please explain the difference between the two?
Sure. So as you mentioned, they're both supply arrangements, and both of them are eligible for use. They're mandatory tools. And the distinction between the two is ultimately in how the deliverables are stated in the statement of work. And so for the task base, it's very deliverables focused, right? So typically there's a lot of precision associated with the scope of work. In a solutions base, you're identifying a problem, and therefore it gives the contractor much more leeway in terms of how they deliver the solution, but they're ultimately accountable for delivering the solution. So that's the predominant difference between the two.
Okay, thank you. And so can you explain a situation where a contracting authority may change from a task-based supply arrangement to the task-based one, or vice versa? Like, when would that happen?
Right. So again, sometimes the issue is that the client may not be fully aware of their needs and how to actually portray them vis-a-vis a scope of work. So there are certainly instances, as we've identified in the report, where a reconsideration of the procurement strategy is appropriate. So we had an example where an ACAN, or an advanced contract award notice, was contemplated for one of the contracts. It went to an internal review committee. That committee said that they challenged the use of an ACAN and would prefer a more competitive process. So ultimately, the procurement strategy was changed in that circumstance from an ACAN to the TSPS task-based. And so documentation was prepared to demonstrate a movement away from an ACAN into a task-based. Now, the problem arises on that specific file when, after that was happened, then it was learned that McKenzie was not qualified under the task-based, and there was a change in documentation associated with the solution-based approach, and there wasn't documentation really identifying why that change was made.
Okay, thank you. And so can you also explain the relationship between the TSPS and the centralized professional services system?
So the centralized system is where you have a repository of all qualified bidders. And so the tool is meant to document, in fact, how many prospective bidders are involved in the process. So it's essentially a database, and depending on the value associated with the specific offering, it's the number of specific suppliers that are included as part of the process. So the higher the dollar value, the more open the competitive process.
Okay, and so what role does CPSS play then in protecting the integrity of government procurement?
It plays a significant role in the sense of documentation. So in order to document that you've complied with the business rules associated with the CPSS, you need to retain accuracy in the number of bidders that you ultimately sent the request to. So again, based on dollar value, it would depend on how many bidders should be the recipients of the opportunity. So you also need to characterize on file exactly who it was sent to ensure that those individual suppliers were in fact qualified to bid. And so sometimes we saw examples where we weren't sure whether in fact all suppliers who should have been identified were.
Thank you. And so, the report identified several instances where that documentation was missing or incomplete. So in your experience, what obstacles do public servants face in terms of documenting their decisions? Like, how common would this be?
So this is a Mr. Chair, this is a long-standing issue that we've seen in many of our procurement practice reviews. The one distinction that I would note specific to McKenzie is the timing of these documentation lapses. So traditionally, we saw a lack of documentation across the board. But here we saw it at sometimes discrete times within a process where we would have documentation present for certain steps of the process, and then at a seminal moment, then there would be a lack of documentation. And that's the part that's concerning, and that kind of brings me back to the negative inferences that I was talking about.
Okay, thank you. And the report also found that the lack of a statement of work makes it difficult for departments to hold a contractor to account in the event of future contractual disputes surrounding the expectations of work to be completed. As well, this lack of documentation surrounding the specifics of the requirement also creates a risk that contract splitting could go unnoticed as the scope of the original requirement is not clearly documented. So can you please expand on the risks associated with the lack of statement of work?
Yeah, so the question, I'll just situate the question. So it comes from the National Master Standing Offer. And so there was 3 documents that were ultimately required as part of the call-up process, and none of them was a statement of work from the department. So it was a proposal from the proponent, which in this situation was McKenzie, that ultimately drove the call-up process. So without the lack of a definitized statement of work, it's very difficult to say that the performance is either lacking or has been delivered. And so it's in those circumstances where ultimately the government is being led by the supplier, and the supplier provides the proposal, including the pricing, without the grounding of a statement of work, and that's why we found it so concerning.
For sure. And can you also explain that notion of contract splitting that I mentioned and what those consequences would be?
Right. So
I'm
contract
afraid
splitting is when
Sorry, Mr. Yaglick, I'm sorry, we're basically down to 3 or 4 seconds, so perhaps we can get back to it on Ms. Owen's next round. Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Yaglick and Mr. Mercereau. I think that your report was very enlightening, but it's also frightening because it's the second time that we are seeing a procurement process that has not followed the rules. And even in your report, if you look at paragraph 36, it says that over the past few years, this has happened quite frequently. Here's my question. Are we dealing with a systemic problem here? Are we dealing with influence peddling, collusion, perhaps problems with training the staff? Perhaps it's all of those things?
I think the answer is a big one, and I was hoping I'd have the opportunity to raise this. We are seeing consistent problems across the federal procurement landscape. If you go back even as far as a decade and further, you'll see many of these issues are repetitive in nature. It's not simply one issue, but what I will say, and this was what I believe the theme for this report is, that perhaps the system has lost confidence in delivering results for the project authority. And so as a result, people are using the system in ways that it shouldn't be used. I don't always like to present problems without solutions, so I will say that our office is currently working on potential solutions to these large standing procurement issues. And if given the opportunity, I'd like to talk about some of those potential solutions.
Merci beaucoup. Certainement.
Thank you very much. I will certainly give you the opportunity to do so. But there's a question that comes to mind. And with your proposed questions, I would say that McKenzie is small, it's big internationally, but when it comes to Canadian government contracts, it's still small. It's bigger than it used to be, but there are companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers, Deloitte Touche, etc., who have a lot more contracts. But if we were to look at perhaps a sample of the companies, you can't take all of them, of course, but if you took a sample of them, do you think you would see the same problems as what you raised in your report?
To answer that, not having done the review, I can't anticipate what I would see in other circumstances. As I mentioned, for the National Master Standing Offer specifically, McKenzie was one of 5, right? So we would anticipate seeing many of the same issues associated with the formation of the NMSO in those other 4 occurrences, but I can't say with certainty because we didn't do those reviews, unfortunately.
Wow. Perhaps you didn't go into this level of detail, but with regard to the public servants, if you look at the people in charge of contracts, do you see the same names coming up with the same errors? Lack of documentation, or is it more widespread?
So the genesis for our review is always looking at the practices of departments, right? And so we're not typically looking to name individuals, but I think recently we have started looking more closely at the names of individuals, departments, programs, etc., to see if we can see trends at that level as well. Here we did not see political influence. We also didn't see many repetitive actors. Obviously, in the formation of the National Master Standing Offer, PSPC was the contracting authority in all of the call-ups, so there was unified kind of analysis done by one group within PSPC for that National Master Standing Offer. So if you ask for community, that's one community that I would identify, or people, as you asked.
Merci.
Thank you. So who is part of that community? Which community are you referring to?
SPC, they have a group who handles these kind of procurements that fall under the National Master Standing Offer. I believe they're referred to the ZM group. That's the acronym that they go by. And then within the call-ups themselves, you would have noticed in the report of the 19 total call-ups or contracts that were issued under the National Master Standing Offer. National Defence had the largest number, and among those, half of them were from one unit, the Chief Professional Conduct and Culture Unit. So there was a concentration of call-ups from that particular unit, as well as for a Digital Navy program and the Canadian Joint Operations Command Unit. So there was some concentration among the contracts.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. So I imagine that the analysis of those groups will eventually be done. You might possibly do that.
Views is to ensure that these practices don't continue. And that's the nature of the recommendations we make. So as I've mentioned, the review isn't where it ends. We also conduct a follow-up. So with each of the departments that were subjected to a recommendation, we will go back in and follow up with those departments to test whether in fact what has been implemented by the department is meant to address the actual issues that we saw. So once we do that process, we do issue a report card and we transparently report out on what we saw after the report was finalized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bachrach, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Yeglich and Mr. Mercero. Picking up on where my colleague left off, this issue of there being a systemic problem as opposed to a specific problem with one company is, I think, an important one. And I'm curious, you mentioned that there were 4 other standing offers with a similar structure to the one that was awarded to McKenzie. Which companies were awarded those other 4 standing offers? And if you have the relative value of them, that would be helpful as well.
So the 4 others were Forrester Research Limited, Gartner Canada Co., CEB Inc., Infotech Research Group Inc. And before I give the values, I just want to caveat that how we establish these values is through proactive disclosure. So we know ourselves that there are issues with proactive disclosure, so we don't want to say that these numbers are absolutely accurate, but these are the best that we could identify based on our review. So Gartner by far would be the most significant, coming in at approximately $240 million. Next would be Infotech Research Group at $20.8 million. Then you'd have Forrester Research Limited at $12.5 million and CEB Inc. at $6.4 million.
So my question is, given that you've looked into one company and you found these problems with procurement, and you've extrapolated from that and suggested that there's a systemic issue, what would need to be done to confirm your suspicion that there's a systemic issue with the way the procurement system is being used?
Well, Mr. Chair, the difficulty in answering that question is it's not a specific issue, it's multiple systemic issues, right? And so I do think, and I've used this terminology internally, but I'll share it, I do think the time is now to act. We really need to reconsider federal procurement in its totality. I know it seems like a pretty dramatic thing to say, but I think I've been in this role for over 6 years. I think we've done a great deal of foundational work in terms of what we've seen in the landscape, and I'm fearful that if I don't start acting in a more aggressive manner, significant changes will not come. And I don't think Band-Aid solutions are the answer. I think there needs to be significant rethinking as to how federal procurement is done.
Does part of that rethinking involve looking at how to rebuild the public service so that we're not outsourcing hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of contracts to consulting firms that are likely overcharging us for their services?
So we are developing a piece on the potential creation of a chief procurement officer. And that role would have kind of the mandate of looking into foundational changes, including the interplay of various organizations that are currently implicated in federal procurement. But I think if you ask all players or actors in the federal procurement sphere, and they answered honestly, they would tell you that the system does not produce the results that they want in an efficient and timely manner. So I think that
they hack the system, essentially. They have a tool to do a job. The tool doesn't work, so they use the tool in a way it's not designed. Is that?
I think that's a fair characterization.
Okay. What are the next steps from here? How can the committee contribute to this work of reforming the procurement system so it delivers better for the public?
So one identifiable solution that I think is well known within the federal procurement space is the creation of a vendor performance management framework. What that will do is that will actually evaluate the performance in the administration phase of how suppliers are actually performing. Because I do think a part of this is an avoidance of poor performers. So currently there is no federal vendor performance management framework. PSPC is piloting an individualized policy within their department to implement vendor performance management. But like I said, I've been in my role for 6 years, and this is probably my #1 priority. I repeat this ad nauseum. I think this is an immediate step that needs to be taken. I think this will help address the poor performers. It will legitimize the process. And again, that I would describe as a medium-term solution. I'm not naive enough to say it's a short-term solution. And the creation of the chief procurement officer in and of itself is not a solution. But it is the first step towards what I would describe as transformational change.
One of my colleagues mentioned that some of these revelations are similar to the ones that we received regarding the ArriveCan procurement. I'm just wondering if you can do a very quick compare and contrast what we saw in that case, what we see in this case.
So I would say that what we saw in that case was we saw favoritism in a different way through what I would describe as transparent favoritism, which was by having overly restrictive criteria. So anyone who looks at those criteria will be able to assess whether in fact there is a desired outcome. Here, it's not happening at surface level, it happened below the surface. So the change of procurement strategy wouldn't be made transparent to suppliers. Whereas in ArriveCan, I would argue the restrictions were made transparent to other suppliers and they were aware of the restrictive nature, and that may have caused a chill effect in terms of the number of bidders. What I'll also say is the 7 competitive processes that McKenzie won, they were either the sole bidder or the sole compliant bidder in every one of those processes. So that also tells you that on the supplier community, there's something not working, right? So it's not just on the governmental side, it's also on the supplier community side, because if there's a known buyer who pays, why is the community not participating in greater volumes? And so there are legitimate questions to be asked across the board, and that's why I posit the idea that this is the time for action.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mr. Brock, go ahead, sir.
Chair, thank you, gentlemen, for your attendance today. I'm going to share some of the comments of my colleagues in terms of some of the overlap between McKenzie and Government of Canada strategies, also known as GC strategies. And in terms of the focus of the documentation, which in most cases on both sides of the equation were often missing, incomplete, altered after the fact, it really begs the question, and this is something I get continuously and daily from constituents from all across this country, right, is who is actually responsible for this? It's one thing for us as parliamentarians to expose the rot and the corruption in this government, in this broken procurement process. But where are the consequences? So that's going to be the focus of my first round with you. And the consequences, in my view, ought to be criminal in nature. Because you have a mandate, Ombudsman, I know you do. You mentioned that during your last appearance at OGO, that if you uncover elements of criminality, and I believe your threshold is a mere suspicion of criminality. Am I correct in that assessment? a mere suspicion of criminality?
So there is nothing formal in either the legislation or regulation in regards to criminality.
Okay.
However, that being said, if we were to see something that would give rise to a suspicion of criminality, we would refer that to the RCMP.
Sure. And your threshold is the lowest rung of the ladder in terms of ultimately until you get a conviction. There's suspicion, then there's reasonable and probable grounds by a police service, then there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt by Crown attorneys, and ultimately a conviction. So a suspicion is a very low threshold. I'm looking at literally the same sort of criminal charges as it relates to McKenzie as the Government of Canada strategies, who the RCMP have confirmed and have raided his house a couple of weeks ago. They're looking at 2 counts, fraud under Section 380 of the Code and forgery under Section 267 of the Criminal Code. So I know that you may not be comfortable in answering this question, but I'm going to put it to you in any event. Do you feel, given your review of McKenzie and the irregularities and the strong presumption against a favoritism towards McKenzie over any other contractor, that there is an element of fraud in relation to the Government of Canada? Yes or no, sir?
You always ask me these difficult questions with only yes and no options.
If it's not a yes or no, I'll allow you to expand.
So I would say no. In this circumstance, what we did see is we saw a bunch of different reference points across different departments, and that's why you see in our conclusion we say in some, right? So within any given department, we didn't see 10 examples of favoritism, right? The only example of communal favoritism, I would say, was in the creation of the National Master Standing Offer, right? It offered an opportunity to contract in a unsolicited way, so where it's directed to McKenzie on a repetitive basis. And so that would be what I would identify as the singular most problematic aspect of this review.
Are you familiar with the definition of fraud under the Criminal Code?
Yes.
Okay. Everyone who by deceit, falsehood, or other fraudulent means defrauds the public, in this case the taxpayer, of any property, money, in this case taxpayer funds, or valuable security or any service, if it's over $5,000, proceeding by indictment and imprisonment for 14 years. So favoring one particular company, allowing them to egregiously break the procurement rules in non-compliance of numerous statutes, numerous regulations, numerous policies, and in fact, the PSPC themselves published a document calling Doing Business with the Government of Canada, where they highlight openness, transparency, and accountability. In all those circumstances, do you not see a low threshold case of making out that the Government of Canada, through the PSPC and other departments, are defrauding a taxpayer by favoring McKenzie over other legitimate vendors?
Right. And
Could an argument not be made, sir?
And that I have to ask to be a yes or no, because we're out of time.
could an argument be made? Yes. Did we see it? No.
Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Baines, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our Ombudsman and Mr. Mercero for joining us today. I wanted to go back into, you mentioned that the procurement process has been going on for decades. You'd like to obviously provide solutions, recommendations. I want to give you that opportunity. But even in previous committee meetings, when we've asked these questions to around procurement, and we've learned that the process has not changed for almost 20 years, and over that time, we've seen people that are continuing to work with departments and people that within government departments have been there for a long time, decades even, and relationships are built, and again, things are happening where you know someone, everybody's, all the people that are getting procurement services all know one another. They interchange, they'll do different jobs continuously, simultaneously. So that whole relationship building, like how much are you seeing of that? Is that, and maybe if you can talk about some of the steps that you wanted to take.
Yeah, so absolutely. So there's multiple layers to your question, Mr. Chair, which is, how is federal procurement done? Is there a relationship component to federal procurement? And the answer is absolutely yes, there is a relationship component to this. And that goes back to the point I was making about vendor performance management. How do you actively track this information about who the good performers are and who are the poor performers? And you need to do that in a transparent way. And that's the problem. It's not being done. So you had a particularly bad experience with a particular supplier and you never want to work with that supplier again. The system currently doesn't have a mechanism by which that could happen, right? So ultimately what ends up happening is then you use criteria as a methodology by which you create an overly specific restrictive criteria to ensure that that specific supplier cannot participate. That being said, I saw the kind of furrowed brow look when I said that there is no process to currently stop that from happening. So obviously, if someone is charged criminally, there are in fact ways to bar suppliers. But what I'm talking about is not of that nature. I'm talking about a supplier who just doesn't deliver in accordance with the terms and conditions of the contract, but nothing criminal, just a poor performing supplier, right? At the end of the day, people want to deliver on their projects, right? And when not given an opportunity to deliver on their project because the supplier that was hired using the process that they were given ultimately doesn't deliver, it's frustrating for all people. So not just the taxpayer, but also the government officials. And I can speak on their behalf for an instant as well. They're frustrated with the system as well. Not just the contracting authority, but also the project authority, right? The project authority wants to deliver on their project and is being told what procurement tools to use. And if those tools don't lead them to the outcomes that they want, then you have to understand why they're looking at alternatives.
Okay, then what are some of the step-by-step changes you're thinking?
Right, so I think I was kind of identifying two of them, and those are the main two that we've identified as an office to say that these are both significant and would have long-standing impact. So one is the transformational change, and I can't sit before you today and tell you that I have all of the answers. But I will say that I think there needs to be an outside lens looking at what prospective changes need to take place, who's not an active participant in the process. So that's why we're advocating for the creation of a chief procurement officer. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece is this government-wide vendor performance management tool, because it will not only eliminate the problem of poor suppliers, but will also reward positive engagements with suppliers. So good suppliers aren't necessarily treated better, but will be given consideration for their good performance on federal government contracts.
And what's that tool look like?
So it's literally called a vendor performance management framework, and it's a transparent government-wide tool where anyone who delivers under a federal contract would be evaluated after completion of the project. There are a number of models that already exist. If you look at other jurisdictions, they would have vendor performance management frameworks. So this isn't something unique that I've created on my own. This is something that's being done in multiple jurisdictions. It's just not being done at the federal level.
And what examples can you give?
I mean, you could even look at the city of Ottawa as an example, but there are multiple examples. And again, I hate to sound like a salesman on this one, but on our website, we've actually published an initial piece on vendor performance management where we have looked at under other vendor performance management frameworks specific to dispute resolution. But we are writing another piece on the Chief Procurement Officer that we hope to publish in the next several months that I would encourage everyone on this committee to read.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Mrs. Vignola, please, for 2.5.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Yiglich, in paragraphs 91 and 92 of
So on the supplier side, there are concerns.
McKenzie that suggested this, and the government followed suit. Is this a tendency that you've also found in your report?
Mr. Chair, I don't believe so, no.
Mr. Bachrach, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Yeglich, you asked the question, why are other companies not bidding? And I wanted to dig into that a little bit. Is it because other companies know that the system is being kind of hacked to favor certain companies and they don't feel it's worth the effort to participate in the process if the outcome is predetermined?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So part of our role in the office is to speak to all stakeholders. One of the stakeholder groups that we do speak to is the supplier community. So we capture all of the information that they provide to us on a yearly basis. And I will say we had a record number of cases this past fiscal year. What we hear with clarity is they do believe that there is a restrictive nature in the requirements. So whether they be biased or unfair, or overly restrictive, those are constant issues that are raised to our attention by the supplier community. So to answer your question directly, is that happening? Yes, there are concerns on the part of suppliers that there are defined results before a competition is let. So as a result, it diminishes competition. But I also don't think that that's the only factor. And that's the piece where we do need to lift the hood and understand more. Before committee, I represented the statistic of over 5 years where we did an analysis of competitive procurements. In 34 of the instances, there was one sole bidder on competitive processes. So that's a particularly high number. And so our hope is that in future that we're able to look at that number and unpackage also on the supplier side why that's happening. So certainly I know the focus of many of my remarks have been on the governmental side, but I do think there needs to be also an engagement strategy with suppliers to understand why they are not participating in greater numbers, particularly in times of the economy perhaps not behaving as well as one would like.
I'd love to get into the sort of the decision making or the mindset that is leading the people who are responsible for the procurement to repeatedly choose the same vendors and kind of adjust the process in order to have an outcome that results in them working with the same people over and over again. And I'm wondering about the perception of risk. Like obviously there are risks of working with the same underperforming vendor over and over again, which is that, you don't get great results. There's also a risk of dealing with new entrants that you might not have relationships with, all of that sort of stuff. On which side of that risk equation do you see the procurement managers leaning more heavily? Like, are they avoiding risk by favoring underperforming standing contracts versus a more competitive process where you might end up with a wild card that results in a real adverse result?
So, Mr. Chair, I think where you look at restrictive criteria, I believe the correct answer in this circumstance is there is a known supplier who would meet those characteristics. I don't think it's done in the abstract, hoping that an unknown entity can comply with those restrictive criteria. I think there is a specific vendor in mind when restrictive criteria are created.
Okay, thanks very much. Mr. Genuis, please go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair. It's great to be back at OGO after an unusually long hiatus. And Mr. Jeglich, thank you for the incredible work you're doing on behalf of Canadians, bringing to light these various significant problems in our procurement system. Your report talks about favoritism in terms of the government's treatment of McKenzie, how they favored McKenzie, how they structured systems in order to give contracts to this favorite consulting company of the Prime Minister. McKenzie benefited from this favoritism. And based on the previous work of this committee, it's clear how this happened. Dominic Barton was brought in to chair the Prime Minister's Growth Council at the same time as he was the managing partner at McKenzie. McKenzie analysts did so-called pro bono work for the Growth Council. Andrew Pickersgill, who ran the Canadian operations, supplied the analysts to do the pro bono work. But while he was supplying McKenzie analysts to do supposedly helpful pro bono work for this growth council that was chaired by Dominic Barton, he was also selling to the government. And so you have this process where Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Dominic Barton are kind of making this connection at the top between McKenzie and the government of Canada, and then that is clearly filtering out over time throughout the whole system, where the connection at the top was shaping and impacting the kind of procurement that was happening across government to work to the advantage of McKenzie. That led to the establishment of the National Master Standing Officer. I want to ask, just in terms of the analysis you did, about specific individuals involved and what roles they played in getting these things established. So could you speak to Dominic Barton and Andrew Pickersgill, for example, and where they showed up along the way in terms of looking at how this favoritism manifests itself?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So in our review, those names, to my knowledge, did not come up. I'll look to Derek just to confirm, but my belief is that those names did not come up.
I can confirm that Dominic Martin's name did not appear. Andrew Pickersgill, I'd have to go back and review their documentation, but I don't recall seeing that just off the top of my head, but I can come back to you with that information.
Okay, if you could provide some follow-up information in writing about some of the specific individuals. I'm not at all surprised in the sense of Dominic Barton, because I see that connection having been made at the top between the Prime Minister and him, but the selling process happened by Andrew Pickersgill bringing in these analysts. It was the relationship that happened at the top between the Prime Minister and the leadership at McKenzie that then allowed this favoritism to take place. We know as well that there's been a lot of kind of interplay between senior Liberal offices and McKenzie. There's a former member of Parliament in the government caucus that was a former manager at McKenzie. We've had former staff members from the government go to work for McKenzie. What kind of information were you able to identify around sort of political involvement, decisions made by ministers, by ministerial staff that were part of this sort of broader culture of favoritism for McKenzie?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So in the report, we found one example of where a minister approved a contract. It was an ESDC contract. I believe the question came up before you entered the room, but essentially what happened in that circumstance was it was as a result of an internal delegation document within the department that required that contract due to the value to go to the minister for approval. So that was with Minister Tassi for approval. But that would be the only example in our report where we saw any action on the part of a political actor.
Okay, thank you. One of the other issues that frequently comes up with McKenzie is questions of conflict of interest, how McKenzie works for governments and then also works with people who deal with governments. For instance, they work for health regulators, and then they've also famously, tragically worked for certain manufacturers of opioids. In your work, did you see clear instances where they were doing work, for instance, for Health Canada, for other entities in government, where they were also working for companies that the government regulates? I appreciate, part of the difficulty is they have not been willing to give even this committee a client list when requested. But were you able to identify instances of those kinds of conflicts?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So I can answer no, but that's because we weren't looking for that specifically.
Well, just in the time I have left, I just reiterate how important it is, and I think there hasn't been the agreement that I would have hoped for in the past, but how important it is that this committee gets the documents that it had previously requested. There previously had been agreement to order, and we hadn't been able to get in the past.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Kuzmirchuk, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, Mr. Jeglich, for your testimony. Again, you always bring so much information and light and context to this critically important conversation that we are having. McKenzie is a global company that has 40,000 employees around the world. 60 countries, and we see that their clients represent a broad swath of both private sector companies, some of the largest private sector companies in the world, but also governments as well. Recently, the Alberta Conservative government hired McKenzie to do a review of its school policy, schools education system. As well, recently we saw the provincial conservative government hiring, I believe it was a sole source contract, hiring McKenzie to review its or to provide direction on its pandemic response, coordinating its pandemic response. We're seeing governments of all stripes at all levels, federal, provincial, municipal, hiring McKenzie. Can you provide us with some insight on why McKenzie is successful at receiving contracts at all levels of government and from governments of all political stripes?
Mr. Chair, so obviously I could not comment on why other jurisdictions would be contracting with a specific supplier. But we did see examples in the documentation that they have a good reputation, and that good reputation is ultimately what leads the starting point of the conversation. One clarification I need to make, though, is we're not reviewing the practices of McKinsey. We're reviewing the practices of the departments who ultimately contracted with McKinsey. So I think it is an important distinction. So where we talk about favoritism, it's favoritism on the part of department actions, not on the part of McKinsey.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Your report has been consistent with previous reports. You're finding weaknesses and gaps in terms of justification, as you mentioned, at critical seminal points of when a decision is made to provide a contract. So weakness in terms of justification, written justification for a certain decision. You highlighted the weaknesses in documentation during the process, which would provide us with confidence that the rules are being followed and that it is fair and that Canadians are getting value for money. In your evaluation, did you find fraud?
No, Mr. Chair, no, we did not, to my knowledge.
In your evaluation, did you find corruption?
Mr. Chair, no, I don't believe we did.
In your evaluation, did you find political interference in those contracts?
Mr. Chair, no, we did not. As I mentioned before, there was only one instance in the review that we did where there was intervention on the part of any political actor.
Okay. We talk about benchmarking. McKinsey was brought in for benchmarking. Can you tell us what is benchmarking and what exactly were we benchmarking typically in terms of those contracts?
So I actually asked Derek if he could speak to this one. So I know Derek's prepared to answer this one, but I can fill in some of the gaps if, yeah.
And I won't claim to be the benchmarking expert, but I'll try to cut through a lot of the consultant speak and describe it. So you have a company like McKinsey has clients all over the world, and they run surveys in these companies, and they can ask a variety of questions. The ones that we're speaking about here are mostly around information technology, so the maturity of an organization's information technology processes and procedures, as well as its culture. So in this context, what they do is they will select what they refer to as their solutions. There's 9 different solutions they offered to the Government of Canada. And they'll administer a survey within the organization. They will receive the responses. They'll do the analysis of those. They'll compare those results against information within their proprietary database, and then they'll provide a report back to the government organization who issued the contract. So that's, in a nutshell, how it's supposed to work. I think what we saw is that they ended up being a lot more than that.
Perfect. That's our time. We'll go to you, Mr. Brock.
I'll take it.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, Mrs. Goosey.
Thank you very much. I wanted to go back to the non-competitive contracts that your office reviewed that were missing conflict of interest declarations from those who reviewed the bid submissions. something that we've really been focusing on, I think, at government operations as well as public accounts, the aspect of the conflict of interest. So we learned a couple of weeks ago that 38% of public servants who declared a conflict of interest were determined to be in an actual conflict of interest. How concerning is it that this number is already high, yet we seem to be missing multiple conflict of interest forms in many contracting instances?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So obviously, as the member rightfully points out, the Conflict of Interest Declaration is a seminal document, particularly for evaluators. So I believe the statistic you provided was in general, but this is specific to the evaluation of proposals, where I would argue it's even more important to have these declarations on file, and also to bring awareness to the issue. So this is a conversation we had in previous reviews as to whether conflicts of interest would need to be completed by all participants in an evaluation, including public servants. And we've strongly advocated that yes, all participants in an evaluation should complete a conflicts of interest declaration as a participant. So the fact that they're missing is problematic, absolutely.
We saw that the Department of National Defense has contracted a total of $29.1 million with McKenzie, also noting that they had the greatest number of contracts as well, a total of 12 out of the 19. That's a significant amount, almost 2/3. But we also learned over the past few months that another major contracting firm with defense, known as Dalian, back to my original question, has received millions of dollars from this department and even started working with them while the owner of Dalian, their company, continued to sign the contracts. In this instance, there was no conflict of interest form signed. Due to McKenzie's favored nature, do you feel that there are numerous connections that have led McKenzie to make $29 million from this department? Defense specifically.
So, Mr. Chair, unfortunately, I can't answer that question in terms of the connections. What we saw, we reported out on in the report. In terms of any connections made behind the scenes, I can't speak to.
PSPC stated that they took issue, I used that phrase in my first round, with the assumptions and interpretations of your report, as they were not the same as their department. Do you think a department can simply state their own version of events if they have not bothered to provide any evidence to support their claims?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that was the nature of our discussions with the department. We certainly believe that the version depicted in the report is accurate. In terms of any assumptions made, they were made only based on the facts that were provided. So if there was a fact provided and no fact provided on the other side, then I think we were safe to make the assumptions that we did make. So there were a number of instances where we had discussions with the department to understand their perspective, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to achieve here is factual accuracy, which is why we engage with the department. First of all, it's required by way of the regulation, but second of all, we want to make sure that the report accurately reflects the facts. So if there are facts that are wrong, we want those to be corrected before we finalize the report. I think the issue that the department was having was any inferences made as a result. So, you know, a conclusion made on what they saw as unrelated facts, and we saw them as related.
Do you think it's respectful of your work to have a department push back on what you find?
Mr. Chair, absolutely. I feel it's within the department's purview to put forward their view, but then I would implore them to document their view in the future so that when they come forward with what actually happened, that it's reflected in the documentation, as opposed to after the fact surmising what may have happened.
Although, I think that's my time. Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much.
We'll give you 10. We'll give you 8 seconds on your next round. Mrs. Binola, oh, sorry, Mr. Jouari.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome back, Mr. Chair, with your colleague. Good to have you back in the committee. So what I've heard so far is our procurement process is quite complicated. It's outdated, and department goes around at times to make sure that they get the job that they're trusted to do. I also heard that there's no evidence of fraud, there's no evidence of criminal activities, no political interference, no mention of the PM or Mr. Dominic Barton, which is good. And then it come to the question, well, why McKenzie? So the question I have is where my colleague, Mr. Kuzmichuk, started going, and what does McKenzie do? And I heard from Derek that, well, they do technology and culture benchmarking activities. And then we get into, well, what does benchmarking activity means? Means that they look at it, where the department or the organization is, they look at best practices, they figure out where the gap is, they develop a roadmap. So here's my question. If the government of Canada is trying to develop a roadmap of updating their technology and changing the culture and changing the processes, what type of organization should they reach out to at the outset to be able to develop that roadmap for them?
Absolutely. So, Mr. Chair, it's a fair question. I think there are a number of approaches by which you can consult the supplier community in a transparent way to obtain information. I think the approach taken here was to establish multiple non-competitive national master standing offers. As you heard me mention before, there are 5 in total. So that dilutes some of the favoritism that was seen towards McKinsey because there was the creation of 4 other national master standing offers.
Thank you for going there. So you mentioned Gartner. What does Gartner do?
Mr. Chair, I don't believe I'm qualified to answer that. I don't have any specific knowledge, but Gartner is a multinational consultancy.
So Gartner actually is another arm of, let's say, of industry who provides a lot of data, and they develop quadrants, which they say who is at, as it relates to the topic, where they're performing, who are the top performers, what are the best practices, et cetera, et cetera. Do you know what does Infotech do?
Mr. Chair, no, I do not.
Okay, so I guess I'm going to stop by, not going down the road. But what consistency I see is the complementary role that those 4 and McKenzie played with each other, because what the complementary role is, when you're trying to do a benchmarking and when you're trying to develop a roadmap for a transformation of an organization such as Government of Canada, you really need industry best. And coming from a consulting background, McKenzie is one of the best on developing strategy, specifically around IT, specifically around culture. And the other 4 organizations that was highlighted here, they are the one that they can provide a complementary set of data and set of benchmarking to the work that McKenzie is doing. So I think the approach that the Government of Canada has done by making sure that we get one of the best, and also making sure that we have other advisory at that level to be able to validate whether McKenzie is telling us and have another pair of eyes, and actually 4 other pair of eyes, it's a wise decision. However, having said all of that, we see inconsistency, and we see that inconsistency around different stage of the process that we've switched back and forth between following the procurement process and not following the procurement process. And that's where I suggest probably we should focus on. With 30 seconds to go, is there anything that you've seen among those steps that we have, those activities that we have stepped out of the procurement process that would shed some light of why would something like that happen?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I think what we saw concerning in the creation of the National Master Standing Offer was the justification for the exception. So there's nothing wrong with the government wanting the best solution, but it's the methodology used to create the pathway to achieve that best solution. And so here I would argue that there are exceptions under the government contracting regulations, which was cited. So it's 6D, where only one person can perform, which was cited to allow for the creation of the National Transformational Master Standing Offer. However, the rationale was limited to the tools that McKenzie offers, right? And so it was rationalization of why we need the McKenzie tools rather than the governmental objective. So the governmental objective should have been the focus, and then saying only one supplier could meet that governmental objective, that would have been an appropriate understanding of the rationalization. But that's not what we saw.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. If you'd like to talk about this at the end of the rounds of questioning, that would be a possibility that I would be open to as well.
In the translation that came through as supply, I assume it's the Minister of PSPC? Right. Are you just putting the motion on notice, or do you wish to have it tabled and debated right now?
Tel que je l'ai dit, je la dépose.
As I said, I'm going to table it today. And if my colleagues agree, we can discuss it after the rounds of questioning in order to respect everybody's time allotment.
You have about, well, you have a couple seconds, but we'll go to Mr. Backrack then.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to kind of go up to the 10,000 foot level for people who might be watching this committee and wondering what the impact of all this is. We've talked a little bit about the impact on other companies that are seeking government contracts, but there's a public interest here, and I wonder, Mr. Yeglich, if you could talk a little bit about, what having a broken procurement process across all government procurement, what the result is for the public, average Canadians that are, watching this and wondering what the impact on their lives is.
Mr. Chair, so that's a good question, and it's something that I think is a fair question as well. I think, could we achieve better value for money for the taxpayer if the system worked more efficiently? And the answer is absolutely yes. I think that there's mechanisms in government procurement that need to be reconsidered that ultimately lead to a much more efficient system. Something that we hear, and I hate to use this word because it sounds like a broken record, but simplification, right? And simplification is always used in the context of trying to simplify what exists, right? But you're taking a very burdensome system and trying to make the burdensome system simpler, right? I think there's a different way to approach this problem. So the real cost is time and money, right? So a lot of time is spent on crafting procurement solutions, and a lot of money is ultimately wasted where competitions lead to no competitive tension in the pricing, right? So the price, yes, there's an evaluation whether the price is fair and reasonable in many instances, but there is no price tension that would result in a lower price ultimately for the taxpayer.
Your investigation spanned the years 2011 to 2023, and we see the real spike in non-competitive procurement with McKenzie after kind of 2019 in those years, which corresponds to the pandemic. I'm wondering to what extent the pandemic broke the procurement system, or whether the systemic issues that you are seeing pre-existed and were simply accentuated by the conditions of the pandemic.
Mr. Chair, so thank you for the question. I think if you look back at reports dating back, like I said, over a decade, you'll see that they still resonate today. And that was kind of the starting point when I started in this role, was to look back before looking forward. And one thing that I noted was where our office collects data sets from a number of stakeholders, the issues that we see are repetitive in nature. We create what we call a top 10 list. And that top 10 list is pretty static year over year. And it was disappointing to learn that, the same issues permeate. So we said we wanted to be part of the solution. And that's why we started that 5-year review plan to look at exactly those top 10 issues across the 3 LOEs. So we plan to publish that 5-year report shortly. I don't think you'll be surprised by any of the findings in the 5-year report. Many of them have been discussed. But it's again indicative of these are the same issues that we're seeing. Now, I will say that we've seen significant changes in recent years in procurement, the move towards e-procurement. What changes that will amount to are yet to be seen. I think in the early days, I was very optimistic that that could produce very positive results. I wouldn't say I've lost that optimism, but I wouldn't say that I would put all of my optimism in e-procurement. Sorry.
If I could, Mr. Chair, just to say, it's pretty troubling that the same issues have been coming up for a decade and the government hasn't managed to fix them. I think that's something that should worry all Canadians.
A fair comment. Mr. Brock, please.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Yeglich, we finished off my first round discussing fraud. I want to talk now about forgery under Section 366 of the Code, which is defined as anyone who commits forgery by making a false document knowing it to be false with intent upon conviction could be looking at a prison sentence of 10 years. Making a false document is defined in the code to include altering a genuine document in any material part, making a material addition to a genuine document or adding it to a false date, making a material alteration in a genuine document by erasure, obliteration, removal, or in any other way. In your report under Section 110, paragraph 110 of your report, you talk about a number of observations that were creating a strong perception of favoritism towards McKenzie. 110 sub C talks about the inappropriate reevaluation of bids resulting in McKenzie deemed the only compliant bidder and awarding the contract. To an individual parliamentarian with some legal background, I view this as taking an original contract of so many different qualities to that contract and manipulating the contract so that McKenzie, in essence, becomes the successful bidder. In my opinion, sir, as a former Crown attorney, a case could be made out for an element of forgery in relation to that practice. Would you agree with that, sir, that that could be the subject of an RCMP investigation?
Mr. Chair, so I can't definitively answer yes or no to the question because the fact set is a little bit more complicated than what's kind of portrayed here. So essentially, why we made a negative inference in this specific circumstances, this specific file had documentation at all steps of the process except for the point in time that this is identified, where the decision of the evaluation committee was sent to the to the contracting authority. The contracting authority performed the financial evaluations. The results of the financial evaluations were then made known to all the evaluators. It was at this point in time that one of the evaluators saw who the ultimate winning proposal should be. Now, at that point in time, there's no further documentation as to what happened. Ultimately, it was indicated by that specific evaluator that there had been an error in the assessment of one of the criteria associated as part of the technical evaluation. In their opinion.
Which could in essence be a material, excuse me, a material alteration of that particular term. So I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm just saying, could a case be made out, sir, for investigation? In much the same way you agree with me with respect to fraud.
Right. So.
Right. Okay. I'll move on. I understand your office is also investigating the concept of bait and switch across all federal departments. Is that correct?
So, Mr. Chair, just to clarify, that was reported to the committee that it's something we found reasonable grounds for. As you'll remember, it is a funding issue for our office, so I have put forward a funding request to the department. So pending funding, yes, that is something that we intend to pursue.
If you pursue it, if you undertake it, that in of itself could reveal criminality, correct?
Potentially.
Right. And if you do receive the funding and the approval to proceed, would the bait and switch investigation also include, in these circumstances, McKenzie in much the same way you investigated the Government of Canada strategies?
So, Mr. Chair, I think it is possible that McKinsey contracts are captured by the bait and switch now.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. In your review of the McKinsey contracts with the Government of Canada, did you uncover any evidence of the destruction of documentation that was prevalent throughout the GC strategy investigation?
Mr. Chair, so we didn't see a prevalence of document destruction. We did see, as you noted, that same file where there was an offer to delete a document associated with the financial evaluation, but that would be the only example that I could think of.
I quickly want to get one question out. You talk about a lack of oversight, particularly by the PSPC. Are you in a position to file at a later date all of the individuals who worked at PSPC and CBSA, in fact, all the departments that you reviewed, who are responsible for their involvement with McKinsey and allowing this misuse of taxpayer funds to occur? Can you give us all the names, sir, within those departments?
So, Mr. Chair, what I can do is I can provide you the names that were captured in the documentation that was provided to us.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mr. Sousa, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for being here. It's very important work that you're doing. I mean, we all recognize that we have to do better. It's been decades. It's not just the Government of Canada. It's all levels of government. It's prevalent throughout industry. It's prevalent in other jurisdictions around the world. And I think you can speak to some of that, and we would welcome your comparison as to what's happening here and what we are doing now to try to overcome those challenges. Challenges that you have rightly stated. Challenges I think you have also noted you're working collaboratively with government to try to resolve it. I mean, it's in government's interest, it's in all our interest to see resolution to these matters. And I'm just interested in the way that some of the questions are being posed to you. I've been very interested throughout this deliberations. One of them is really interesting is like, can any one of our committee members commit a crime? Is anybody in this room able to commit a crime? What's your opinion on that?
Yes or no?
Yes or no?
Mr. Chair, yes.
There you go. Does that make it so? Have there been any criminal activity under your investigations?
Mr. Chair, we did not see any.
Do you see elected officials in this government creating corruption in this process?
So, Mr. Chair, the only instance that we saw political actors' involvement was in that one.
Have there been any forgeries committed during your investigations?
Mr. Chair, so unfortunately, I would not be the adjudicator to determine. We have not referenced anything to the RCMP.
My point exactly. We are not the judge. We are not the jury, and we shouldn't be the executioner here. We need to go through the proper process to deliberate over these very issues, which you have done very effectively, and you provided some great recommendations. And those recommendations have been applied, have been recognized by government to try to forthcome. Some of them that you've discussed is in respect to the vendor performance framework. I think we've tried to identify some of that issue. When you look at all the work that McKenzie's been doing, and you look at the extensive work they do across other parts of the world, have they underperformed?
So, Mr. Chair, again, I'm not able to evaluate their performance, and I think it actually underscores the vendor performance management framework point is that, yes, there has been notations made on files that indicate that there have been, they have a positive reputation, but certainly we didn't assess their reputation.
What we want to do is ensure that the government doesn't have repeat procurement of poor performers. I think that was what you said that today. You want to avoid poor performers. You want to ensure that we have evaluation systems that identify those strong performers, legitimate individual organizations with integrity. Can you explain to me the lobbying efforts that happen everywhere in respect to trying to build and enable suppliers to come forward in regards to sourcing opportunities with government? How does that work?
So, Mr. Chair, again, I'm not probably best positioned to explain how lobbying works in procurement. However, I do know that there is, in fact, lobbying. There is a lobbying act where people are required to register interactions with senior level government officials. I think there's a registry that one could consult, so you would be able to see exactly who is lobbying and when.
The reason I'm asking is because one of the things you've identified is how can we help suppliers get in on these deals? How can we grow some of Canadian, especially small business and entrepreneurs, so tap into the opportunities to bid on contracts? With that comes the requirement to help with understanding and laying the groundwork and navigating through the complexity of government system. So some of the recommendations being suggested here is, you know, on the one hand, some are saying government's way too big, cut staff, cut the departments, stop hiring all these people. On the other hand, others are saying, hey, maybe we don't have enough. Maybe we need to have more internal individuals doing these contracts. The skill sets, the degree of change that occurs in this business. Explain to me, how nimble can government be if it doesn't rely on some of these contractors?
So, Mr. Chair, I think you underscored a great point, which is the importance of training public service officials. And I will say that recently I've personally encountered 2 training programs that I think are particularly strong within PSPC and also within D&D. So they have a 1- and 4-year training program for procurement officials where they can participate actively in experimental training. They get insight into a variety of different transactions early on in their career. So I see that as a seminally important thing. And so training of public servants in procurement is incredibly important.
Agreed. And I hope I have some more time.
You're past your time, I'm afraid. Mr. Genois, please.
Thank you, Chair. So we've established that this government had a structural favoritism for McKenzie in terms of their contracting. That exists in a context where, and when we've discussed it at this committee, some of the real horrific abuses that have happened at the hands of McKenzie, advice related to supercharging the opioid crisis, advice on how to identify influential dissidents of the Saudi regime, some of the state-owned companies in the PRC that McKenzie did work for, continuing work for the government of Russia following the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014, advising employees about not participating, for instance, in pro-democracy activities in Russia. So there's many of these different issues. And so I'm grappling with this reality of deeply unethical behavior by McKenzie, and at the same time how they were favored by the government of Canada. Did you look at all at sort of the relationship between ethical conduct and favoritism for a company? It's one thing for a company for decisions to be made about a company being excluded or not, and it's a whole other thing about the company that behaves in the way McKenzie does actually being favored by the government of Canada.
So, Mr. Chair, none of the lines of inquiry actually looked at the ethical behaviors of McKenzie.
Okay, could you comment then on the integrity regime system in particular? Do you think there should be a blacklist? Do you think there could or should be a process whereby, in the context of procurement, officials are looking at the nature of the company they're dealing with and whether it has the kind of values that we would actually want informing advice in government? Do you think that's something that could or should be built into a procurement process?
Mr. Chair, absolutely. I support an integrity and a strong integrity regime where that is something that's contemplated. It also goes hand in hand, and I hate to sound like a broken record today, but it goes hand in hand with the vendor performance management framework as well, because the regime that you refer to kind of speaks to criminal investigations and ultimately convictions and what the implications would be to those suppliers. What I'm talking about is even more broad, is that if, for example, a company promises to deliver something by a certain date, and doesn't deliver, I would still argue there's an ethical component to that. And where they haven't delivered, there should be a consequence to them. So I support what you're suggesting.
Thank you. And of course, you're looking at the government of Canada, not at McKenzie. So you're not evaluating their ethical conduct. You're evaluating the government's approach to procurement. Were people in government asking these kinds of questions about McKenzie? Was that sort of part of the thought process or the deliberation that was happening, or was that not on the table or on the radar screen at all?
So I'll answer to the best of my knowledge, and I'll ask Derek as well. But to my knowledge, we didn't see anything in the documentation speaking to the ethics of McKinsey and Co. But I'll let Derek confirm.
I agree.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm going to use the balance of my time now to move a motion that I put on notice with respect to EV battery manufacturing facilities. I believe that you have that. It's the first motion I put on notice. So if I can, or if we're clear to go, then I'll proceed to speaking to the motion. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So Chair, colleagues, it is the firm conviction of Conservative members on this committee and beyond that the government should be transparent in its subsidy programs, and that those subsidy programs should be aimed at opportunities, jobs, and otherwise for Canadians. And yet we've repeatedly seen disturbing revelations that this government's subsidy programs are directly resulting in the bringing in of foreign replacement workers. The Canadian taxpayers are subsidizing foreign replacement workers because the government has not taken the steps to guarantee and protect jobs in Canada for Canadians. And with that in mind, Conservatives have put forward a clear and simple document production order. This is not about industrial operations or processes. This is about getting the contracts to look at, to allow us to see what the government did or did not do with respect to job guarantees. Do these contracts include actual job guarantees? Do they include protection for Canadian jobs? This is a simple document production motion allowing us to answer that basic question. Conservatives have been and will continue to be persistent in saying that the government should be protecting jobs for Canadians. And this is why we put forward this motion today to order the production of these contracts so that we can see whether or not the government did anything, whether the government was concerned at all with the protection of jobs for Canadians. So this is what we're putting forward today, and I hope this motion will have the support of the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Genuis. The actual motion, both languages went out last week, so hopefully everyone has in front of them. I started speaking list. I had Mr. Perkins, and then Mr. Backrack. Go ahead, Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Chair, I had to manage the microphones here in this new setup. So thank you. I know members will be surprised to learn that I support this motion. And the reason I support this motion is we've been discussing this both in industry committee here and in the House, where commitments have been made. It's okay?
Yeah, just wanted to.
Yes.
Show my hands.
I have you. Go
Okay.
ahead.
I thought you were the translation. Sorry. So commitments have been made by this government from the announcements of these, I think now 5 EV battery commitments by the government onwards, that this would be all about creating Canadian jobs. And we know that, of course, that in fact is not true, particularly in the construction phase. Initially when we raised the concerns around were there guarantees in the contracts about these jobs having to be Canadians, the government said, of course there were. Now, I'll preface the rest of my remarks saying I've actually read the Stellantis contract and the Volkswagen contracts, haven't yet had a chance to read the Honda ones. I'm looking forward to those ones once the government releases them publicly. Government claimed that, as I said, all these jobs, both in the construction phase, with the exception of a few specialty jobs, would be jobs that were for Canadians. And in fact, that's not the case. The Canadian Building Trade Union wrote to the Prime Minister, I believe it was last week or April 10th, with the following letter. And this is what the Executive Director wrote to the Prime Minister. We are writing to request your personal intervention to resolve the ongoing use of international workers in the construction of the Stellantis and LG Nexstar EV battery plant in Windsor, Ontario. Over the last several months, Canada's building and trades unions have diligently worked to secure an agreement to ensure Canadians are employed in the construction and installation phases of this project. Through several months of fruitless meetings with Stellantis and LG, our efforts so far have failed due to LG and Stellantis' intransigence. Despite our best efforts at negotiating a resolution without public or media commentary, LG and Stellantis continue to use international workers through subcontractors for work which our members are ready and able to perform. 180 local skilled trades workers in Essex, Kent region, millwrights and ironworkers are unemployed and available to perform this work. In fact, Canadian workers are now being replaced by international workers at an increasing pace on work that was previously assigned to Canadian workers. 50 more additional international workers are expected to arrive and begin work that was previously indicated was to be performed by Canadian workers.
Mr. Perkins, I'm going to interrupt you for a moment. Seeing that we've got an extensive speaking list, I don't think we will get to it by 1 o'clock. If it's fine with everyone, I'm going to dismiss our witnesses rather than, as much as I'm sure they'd like to sit around and listen, I'm going to suggest perhaps we dismiss our witnesses with our thanks, as always, for the great report and your feedback and suggestions today. And we'll look forward to seeing you back in the future, Mr. Yeglik and Mr. Mercero. Thanks very much. Mr. Perkins, go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As the Executive Director of the Canadian Building and Trade Union had written in his letter to the Prime Minister April 10th, I'll repeat the last line of that paragraph, 50 more additional international workers are expected to arrive and begin work that was previously indicated was to be performed by Canadian workers tomorrow. Canadian workers are being sidelined without consequence. This is a slap in the face to Canadian workers and utterly unacceptable from LG and Stellantis, particularly when their shareholders stand to benefit from more than $15 billion in generous tax incentives from the Government of Canada. This has never been a case of knowledge transfer or specialized knowledge. This is a brazen displacement of Canadian workers in favor of international workers by major international corporations thumbing their noses at both the Government of Canada, taxpayers, and our skilled trades workers. For our members in Essex, Kent, the current state of affairs is intolerable. As such, the Canadian Executive Board has authorized all necessary measures required to remedy the situation. We require your personal intervention with the executives of these corporations. Tell Stellantis and LG to create and to cease and desist their use of subcontractors who are employing international workers to displace Canadian workers on tasks which can be performed by local workers. Instruct your ministers to halt the flow of new international workers to the EV battery plant in Windsor. Require the companies to sign new agreements with labor conditionality on tax incentives. End this intolerable situation for Canadian workers. Canadian building and trades unions are united in our request, and we require action. That was signed by Sean Strickland, the Executive Director. So that's a pretty condemning letter from the head of the Building Trades Union to what's going on in Windsor right now. And it shines a light on the concern that we've expressed about the validity of the claims by the government that there were no foreign replacement workers that weren't really specialized. In fact, there are workers here being brought in from both South Korea and Mexico to Windsor for the construction of this plant that are doing jobs like operating a forklift. Now, there's nothing specialized other than the skills and training in Canada needed for operating a forklift. Yet this government, these Liberals, allow this contract to go ahead. So they claimed in the House of Commons, the government, that there was only one foreign worker permit initially when we asked the questions. Now there's 72, and here they're saying there's another 50 coming in from the Building and Trades Union. So it exposes the disconnect, and I can tell you it's a disconnect because I can tell you what's not in the contract. At no time in the Stellantis contract and at no time in the VW contract does it say you have to hire Canadian workers. It doesn't say that. And I would challenge the government that if they think I'm wrong in my reading of it, and it's pretty simple language, the VW contract's only 28 pages. It's pretty simple wording. It would have been pretty simple to put into those contracts, hire Canadians only. Those words are not in the contract. It would have been very simple to do that. So if the government is going to dispute that what I'm saying is wrong, government members who haven't read the contracts, if the government is going to dispute what I've said is wrong, and they're going to dispute what's actually happening on the ground, then put their money where their mouth is and release the contracts. Show us the money. Show us the commitment. Because if the company is breaching the contract, I would expect the government to be yelling bloody hell at it if it said Canadians only in both the construction and full-time equivalent. But they're not. They're defending the company and saying, oh, it's only 1 or 2. Oh, no, it's 10. Oh, it's 12. Oh, now it's only 72. Well, what is the final number of allowable foreign replacement workers in this contract? And how much are Canadians going to have to pay to employ these foreign replacement workers while 180 people are sitting unemployed in Windsor who are certified to do these jobs that are members of the Canadian Building and Trades Union. So I would ask all members in all of their sincerity, and we've been through this a lot with various motions here, if they are sincere and they want to defend this, to please support this motion that calls for the release of all these contracts. There is a contract. There is also a contract in Northfloat in Quebec, and that's the third, and now we have the Honda one. So release the information. Prove me wrong. I dare you. Prove me wrong. Release them. Transparency, the Prime Minister used to say before he was elected in 2015, is the greatest thing that this new Sunny Ways government was going to do. Was disinfectant, yes. Was a disinfectant. Well, we need some disinfectant now. We need some disinfectant now. Well, I wasn't in the House then, but we need some disinfectant now on the government on this, because clearly what's happening on the ground, what the union is saying is happening, is totally different from what the government claims and totally different from what they say is in the contract. If they're in the contract, then of course they would, if they had job guarantees, they'd be preventing forklift operators and others, which are not specialized skills that are required to come from Korea, to be doing that work in Windsor. What else do we not know that the government has claimed in these contracts that they've been unwilling to share with the public? What else are they hiding? And it's not commercial sensitivity, since they're all at the gravy train. It was all apparently done on the basis of the President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which, as we know, because that's public, says that between now and through the end of the year 2029, 100% of the cost of every battery assembled will be subsidized by taxpayers. 100%. That's the public number on the IRA. So obviously that must be the number that's in these contracts if they mirror it. And then it's 75%, and then it's 50%. So some deal. Yeah, sign me up if you're a foreign business. The government of Canada, taxpayers are going to pay 100% of the cost of the assembly of these batteries, and the government is bragging that somehow this is some great revelation. Well, I'm not sure that there are many multinational foreign companies that wouldn't come here if what they produced was 100% subsidized by taxpayers, and that they got essentially 100% profit from everything they could do, including in the Volkswagen case, where the batteries will be assembled and shipped to Tennessee for cars sold in the United States. So I will leave it there, Mr. Chair, and I'm sure some other members have something to say, but I would encourage all of us to ensure that Canadians' $52 billion now of taxpayer money committed to these contracts be made public, because I don't trust the government, because the union and others are saying what's happening is not what the government's saying. So let's get some disinfectant and release the contracts.
Here, here. Well done.
Thank you.
Mr. Bachrach, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I take some issue with my colleague, Mr. Perkins' use of the phrase foreign replacement workers. And we saw this during the discussion of the recent legislation, which is going to ban the use of scabs or replacement workers, as the euphemism is. And during the entire debate, the Conservatives tried to make it about the use of foreign workers at battery and EV plants, which is a totally different topic, an important one nonetheless. But I am worried that the conflation is not an accident, and that they're intentionally trying to muddy the waters on two very important issues. One, dealing with the use of scabs during strikes and lockouts. The other, the use of foreign workers at these battery plants and electric vehicle factories. Now, I understand that the industry committee is currently studying this. They have a motion, I believe.
C-27.
Excuse me?
We're studying C-27. It's a motion to me.
We can talk later, Rick. I understand that Indu is currently studying this matter, that there's a motion at Indu, and I believe Mr. Perkins was there today. There's a motion to invite the minister to talk about these contracts. It feels to me that this is a very reasonable line of inquiry. It seems to me that it would be important before this motion come forward, that we hear from the minister, ask the minister questions, that we hear from the Building Trades Union and the other unions that are involved, and understand specifically what their concerns are. Because my impression of their concerns is somewhat different from what Mr. Perkins has articulated. I agree that they're concerned about the use of foreign workers. I don't understand. My understanding is not that they want these contracts to be aired publicly. So I think getting some clarity on that fact would be very helpful. And most of all, I think this is better discussed. This motion would be better placed at Indu, because they're currently embarking on a study, or rather they're already studying this very topic. That's my understanding. So I'm going to make an amendment that we insert the following words at the beginning of the motion. That the following motion, that the committee refer.
Okay. All right. Go ahead on the amendment, Mr. Perkins. Yeah. We're on the amendment now.
Okay.
And Mr. Perkins says this is the only person I see with the hands up.
Okay.
Is that okay with you, Mr. Bill?
I'm asking. It's not, you're the chair. I'm just asking where we are.
Yeah, I won't,
Go ahead,
I
Mr.
won't be
Perkins.
long on this point. No,
Hold on 2 seconds. Mr. Kuzmierczak, we have your hand up for the previous speaking order. Is this also on the amendment, or is that from the previous speaking order, please, sir?
I am happy to speak on both the amendment
Okay.
and.
I have you on
this.
for the amendment if you want to put your hand down. Thank you, sir. Go ahead, Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify, Indu is not studying Stellantis. We're in the middle of a very lengthy clause-by-clause discussion on Bill C-27. It was a motion proposed at the end of Indu, probably still discussing it now, to have the minister appear, the Minister of Industry appear, but the motion has nothing to do with the contract, so they're very different. The effort on C-27 will probably take well into the fall, so I don't imagine there will be another study, so to speak, at industry on this. We had one meeting in camera with officials after we viewed the contract. That's it. And that's not a study, and it's not going to be a report either, because it was in camera. So just as a clarification. So on this, lobbing it off to industry is lobbing it off to a committee that won't get to it till before Christmas. And that's not timely when you're spending $52 billion of Canadian money. And this committee has the right to look into any spending and spending commitments. Government operations is its name, the mighty OGO, as I'm told, to look into all of the spending commitments and actual expenditures of the Government of Canada. And some of these expenditures are actually actual now, particularly the construction ones. The government is already subsidizing $500 million of the construction of Stellantis plant and $778 million of subsidy on the construction of the Volkswagen plant before you even get to the production subsidies. And those are the contracts right now that are in dispute, and the money is spending is the actual construction contracts. So I appreciate not wanting to distract the committee's time from its important work. But I think this is the appropriate place to study it, as my friend MP Genuis put forward, because one, it is a government expenditure, and two, because the time at which industry can look at this is not in the foreseeable future because of the extensive nature of the bill C-27, the Privacy and Artificial Intelligence Bill.
Mr. Kuzmierczuk.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate my colleague, Mr. Bachrach, putting forward the amendment and looking at sending this back to INDU, because INDU has been dealing with this issue for months. We had spirited debate at the INDU committee and on this very issue. But I have some grave concerns with this request, and a couple things just to set the context here. I had a chance to speak. I'm in regular contact with the iron workers, with millwrights, with building trades in Windsor, Essex. We absolutely recognize and hear their concerns. Those are important concerns. And I can tell you that Minister Champagne and I have both on different occasions spoken directly with Mr. Dennis Lee, who is the CEO of Nexstar, which is the company, the joint venture that is building the battery plant in my hometown in Windsor, Essex. And we've communicated our expectation that we want to maximize local Canadian workers at every turn and at every opportunity. We've also pushed Nexstar to establish a working committee between the employer and the building trades, so that information can be exchanged, best practices can be exchanged, and any plans can be exchanged in terms of hiring plans moving forward, and also for any conflicts and concerns to be ironed out. And so that has been our position from the very beginning. We want to see local workers, Canadian workers, maximized at every turn. Right now, I drive past the battery plant every single day on my way to work when I am in Windsor. And I see the battery plant being built right now. And it's incredible to see. I have never seen a project of this scale and this size ever. It is incredible to see. And when you drive down Banwell Road, what you see is row upon row upon row upon row of pickup trucks and cars, Canadian workers, local workers building the battery plant. It is incredible. It literally stretches what feels like for kilometers. And the parking lot is absolutely jam-packed with local workers, Canadian workers building the battery plant. And so let's look at some facts here. There are 2,000 workers currently on site building the battery plant. 2,000 workers that are local, that are Canadian, building the battery plant. And when that battery plant is completed, there will be another 2,500 permanent workers building batteries for generations. These are workers who are local, Canadian, and unionized workers. So 4,500 workers related to the battery plant in my hometown here in Windsor, Essex, Windsor-Tecumseh specifically. Right now, there are about 72 workers who are from abroad, who are international. So you've got 2,000 Canadian workers building the plant, and you have another 2,500 permanent workers coming that are Canadian and local. And you have, compare that to 72 workers right now that are international, that are foreign. So that represents, if you just look at who's building the battery plant, that's 4%. That's 4%. It is important to highlight that this is the very first battery plant in all of Canada. The very first battery plant built in all of Canada. And Canada does not have the expertise of building battery plants and running battery plants. This is new. We're trying to build a brand new industry here in Canada. And so it stands to reason that there will be workers from Korea. Korea has been building batteries. LG, which is a Korean company, has been building batteries for over 30 years. They have 30 years experience building battery plants and building batteries. They are the world leader in battery technology. They are coming to Canada to not only help us kickstart and spark a brand new industry that they are world leaders of, but they are here to help train us, to provide Canadians with training so that we will be able to build batteries for generations to come. So the Korean workers that are coming here to not only help install equipment and help us get the battery plant up and running in a timely fashion so that Canadian workers can start working there. 2,500 Canadian workers can start working there. But they're here to help us actually transfer knowledge and give us a head start, to catch us up, to get us up and running so that we can build batteries for generations to come. Windsor is just the start. And when you look at the last 4 years across southwestern Ontario, you see $50 billion in automotive investment here in southwestern Ontario. This is incredible when you see the level of investment in automotive, and specifically in electric vehicles, in battery manufacturing, in vehicle assembly and electric vehicle assembly, and also in building the components necessary that go into batteries. And the most recent announcement was the $15 billion investment, Honda investment in Alliston, Ontario. And that was the latest investment in a string of investments that our federal government delivered to Canada. It's $50 billion. And the Honda investment is the single largest auto investment in the history of this country. And it's the largest battery investment in all of North America. And we delivered it here. And the world is coming here to Canada to build batteries, to build electric vehicles, and to build the components that go into batteries. The world is coming here. You look at Stellantis and LG, Korean company here in Windsor, Essex, 2,500 jobs. You have Volkswagen coming to St. Thomas, just up the road, to build, again, multi-billion dollar investment, 4,000 jobs in Alliston, in St. Thomas, Ontario. Volkswagen, a German company. You have Northvolt coming to Quebec. Again, thousands of jobs to build batteries. Northvolt is a Swedish company. And now you have Honda making huge investments in Alliston, Ontario. And of course, you have Ford and Oakville, and you have General Motors as well, too. And it's the federal government that is stepping in to partner with these companies to bring those investments here and bring those jobs here. And I could understand why the Conservatives want to do everything possible to create a circus around here, to create around this success story in Canada, to try to undermine it, diminish it, to try to diminish what we've accomplished here as a federal Liberal government bringing $50 billion of auto investment to Ontario. In the last 4 years, we've completely revitalized, rekindled, and strengthened automotive and manufacturing in southwestern Ontario. And the reason why the Conservatives want to undermine this good news story, I mean, they oppose everything, but the reason why they particularly want to oppose this progress and this momentum is simply because it highlights the good news that we're delivering here is in stark contrast to the misery that the Conservatives delivered when they were in government 8 years ago. And I could speak to that. 8 years ago, under the conservative government, the previous Conservative government, 300,000 manufacturing jobs were lost in Canada. And the current leader of the opposition, Mr. Pierre Poilievre, was the employment minister at the time, was the jobs minister at the time in Canada when Canada lost 300,000 manufacturing jobs. And we felt that pain in Windsor. We felt that pain because under the previous Conservative government, we had an 11.2% unemployment in Windsor, Essex. 11.2% unemployment. Think about that. We had 30% unemployment for young people who didn't see a future in my community. And so you actually saw my city, under the Conservative government, you saw my city contracting, my community getting smaller because young people were leaving in droves, they didn't see a future, and because you had people leaving Windsor, Essex to go work on the oil sands and send money back because there were no jobs in Windsor, Essex. This was under the Conservatives. And so we know what it feels like in our community when we see manufacturing suffer, when you see factories closing, when you see businesses closing and families leaving. And we know that pain in Windsor, Essex. And so the Conservatives see the $50 billion investment in automotive and manufacturing across Canada in the last 4 years. They see the revitalization of automotive across Canada, and they don't like how that looks. Because again, it makes their performance and their track record look even worse. But we've done it from Windsor to St. Thomas to Oakville to Alliston to Quebec. We are revitalizing automotive and manufacturing, and not only that, we are building the electric vehicle and battery heartland of North America right here in this community. And so, again, it is important to listen to the iron workers, to the millwrights, and the concerns that they have brought forward. And we are communicating that, and we are pushing Nexstar to maximize the local workforce as much as possible. We want to go even higher than the 96% right now, where we see 96% of workers are Canadian and local. We want to up that. And so we will continue to push Nexstar to maximize wherever possible. But the solution that the Conservatives are bringing forward here, where we want to open up contracts to the public, contracts, the agreements that we have signed with these companies and these major investors, is absolutely wrong. It's the wrong path. And it undermines all the agreements that we've brought forward, and it undermines business confidence in Canada, and also it undermines future investment in Canada. And don't take my word for it. Here, I want to read a letter. I want to read a letter into the record here, because this is important. This is a letter that is signed by the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. This is a letter that is signed by the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, representing hundreds of thousands of businesses across Canada. This is a letter signed by the President and CEO of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. This is a letter that is signed by the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association and the Global Automakers of Canada. And the letter goes on to state, "Dear committee members, on behalf of Canada's largest manufacturers and employers, We are writing to share our deep concerns regarding the efforts of the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates to release contracts between the federal government and private sector companies. The efforts of this committee to release confidential commercial contracts threaten to reverse Canada's recent progress in winning job-creating investment. Commercial contracts are negotiated in confidence with the federal government and contain proprietary information, competitive strategies, and intellectual property. There is no other competitor jurisdiction that releases confidential commercial contracts. By making these contracts public, the committee would bring into question Canada's adherence to the rules-based trade and investment system on which our economic prosperity depends. Doing so would inflict permanent damage on Canada's welcoming investment climate. Let me repeat that again. Doing so would inflict permanent damage on Canada's welcoming investment climate. Furthermore, the committee risks doing irreparable harm to Canada's investment attraction negotiating positions. Such an action could result in previously negotiated agreements being reopened in competing jurisdictions using the information to undermine Canada's competitiveness for future investments. We urge the committee to protect the rule of law and uphold Canada's well-deserved reputation as a reliable jurisdiction for job-creating investment. Folks, that is unequivocal. Unequivocal. You have the automakers, the manufacturers, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, all saying that this is a bad move for Canada. This will undermine not just present investment, it will undermine future investment. It will undermine Canada's ability to attract investment and jobs, and it will hand our competitors, jurisdictions in the United States and China and Mexico and elsewhere in Europe, with an advantage. And this is what the Conservative government wants to, or Conservative Party wants to do. And at the end of the day, this impacts workers. This impacts the 2,000 workers building the battery plant in Windsor, the 2,500 workers, Canadian, that will be building batteries for generations to come in Windsor, the thousands of Canadian local workers that will be building batteries in the plant in St. Thomas, in Alliston, in Quebec. This is a wrong path. This is a dead end for Canada. And I honestly cannot believe that the Conservatives are ignoring the letter signed by the Chamber of Commerce, by the parts manufacturers and the car makers. And they're willfully ignoring it because they will do everything possible that they can to diminish the good news story, which is $50 billion of automotive investment in this country, and literally within a few hours drive from Windsor. I mean, this is incredibly dangerous what the Conservatives are proposing here. And it's not just the business community. We had Lana Payne, the president of the largest the largest union in Canada, Unifor, saying that this is ridiculous, that this is nothing but a circus that the Conservatives are trying to drum up here, that this is trying to undermine confidence in these investments. You had the president, Lana Payne of Unifor, publicly stating that this is a wrong move. And you had the president of Dave Cassidy, who's the president of Local 444, who represents 5,000 Stellantis workers in Windsor, that represents 20,000 retirees in Windsor, coming to Ottawa, coming in front of the mic and doing a national press conference where he stated that this is nothing, and I quote, but political hay. This is nothing but a circus, and it undermines the real work that we're doing, bringing investment, auto investment, and jobs to communities like mine. And so you've got the business community saying this is wrong and dangerous. You have Unifor saying this is wrong and dangerous, the folks that represent the workers. And so, no, I will not support this motion where this is going, because I want to listen to, rather than, no offense, Mr. Perkins, but rather than listening to you, I'd rather listen to the folks representing the workers, and I'd rather listen to the folks representing hundreds of thousands of businesses and manufacturers in Canada, that this is simply wrong, that this is egregious. And that's where we stand with this motion. And I'll tell you, I had an opportunity to speak with businesses in Windsor, Essex on this very issue, on foreign workers coming here to help set up the battery plant. And if you speak to manufacturers, if you speak to any manufacturing company in Canada and you ask them about installing equipment, they will say the same thing, that they themselves send Canadian workers to Mexico to install Canadian-built machines, that they will send Canadian workers to the United States to install Canadian-made machines. This is the way the manufacturing world works. And when we install CANDU reactors abroad in other countries, and when we will be installing small modular nuclear reactors in countries and other countries, Canadian machines, Canadian equipment, you absolutely bet your bottom dollar that you will have Canadian workers traveling to Korea, installing CANDU reactors, installing equipment. You will have Canadian workers traveling to the United States, installing Canadian equipment. You'll have Canadian workers going to Germany to install Canadian-made machines and equipment. That is what happens in manufacturing. That is what happens in manufacturing. That is standard operating procedure in manufacturing, especially when some of that equipment is proprietary, especially when some of that equipment, if you don't have those specialized workers installing it, the warranty on that machinery is invalidated. I mean, this is so common. And you talk to every manufacturer, this is common practice. And so where there are instances, so out of those 72 folks from Korea that are here, they are coming here to install proprietary equipment. They are coming here to supervise. They are coming here because they have know-how, and they're sharing 30 years of expertise with us, and they're training Canadian workers. There are Canadian workers right now in Windsor who are traveling to Poland to be trained at the LG battery plant in Wrocław in Poland. There's Canadian workers, as we speak, they're being trained, and there's a knowledge transfer that is taking place. Where there is misunderstanding, or where there is concerns or conflict, again, we absolutely are leaning on Nexstar to make sure we maximize local workers, make sure that Nexstar is listening to CBTU, listening to the iron workers, the millwrights, and pushing them to solve that issue internally. And that's where this issue needs to be solved, and we will continue to push because we want to maximize at every opportunity and every turn. But to open up, to go from this issue.
Sorry, let me interrupt you for a point of order. Sorry, go ahead, Mr. Bachrach.
Mr. Kazmierczak, a chance to breathe and take a drink of water. But with all due respect, I think we're debating the amendment, which is to refer this motion to INDU. And while I appreciate Mr. Kazmierczak is passionately defending his government's approach on these contracts, I don't think it has anything to do with the very procedural amendment to refer this to another committee. So I would just ask, Mr. Chair, that you rule on my point of order.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. I was wondering when someone was actually going to bring that up. Our colleague from Northern British Columbia does have a point, Mr. Kazmierczak. We are debating the amendment and not the motion itself, if you could get to the amendment. But you had a good run there, sir.
No, I appreciate that, but again, I have an issue with the direction of this entire discussion. I have an issue with Indu, even in the debate that is taking place in Indu as we speak. Because in Indu they're studying the motion, which is to basically open up the contracts. So I have an issue with that. I have an objection. I have an objection to the amendment. I have an objection to the motion. I have an objection to where both the amendment and the original motion are leading, and I'm trying to explain why. And Mr. Chair, this is serious for my community. This is serious for my community. This is playing around as I see it, and as we see it in my community, and as Dave Cassidy sees it, and as Lana Payne sees it, and as the chair, the manufacturers see it. This is dangerous territory. This is dangerous territory. And that is what I need to make clear as we discuss this. I object I have serious reservations, and I object to the original motion. I reject it. And I have serious concerns with the amendment as well, too, because again, I object to where both of those are leading. It's a fundamental principle. And again, I just don't understand. I just don't understand why you can have the president of Unifor, the largest union in Canada, saying that this is wrong and egregious. How you can have the president of our local Unifor 444, who represents auto workers in Windsor, saying that this is political theater, this is political hay, this is egregious, and this is wrong. And how you could have the CEO and the president of the parts manufacturers, the automakers, the Chamber of Commerce saying this is egregious, this is wrong, and this is dangerous. And we could still be having as a committee, and we're completely ignoring all of those voices from labor and industry, and we're listening to Mr. Perkins. But we choose to listen to Mr. Perkins and Mr. Genuis and entertain their dangerous motion. I don't understand how we can do that. Like, I really don't understand how we could do that. And this is a serious motion, because this is a motion that that undermines the very hard work of the last 4 years to beat out other jurisdictions that were going after these investments, that were leaving no stone unturned, that were fighting tooth and nail to land these battery plants. And we won those investments. Those were hard-won investments. And in a lot of those investments, they were photo finishes. It was very close with other jurisdictions.
Mr. Kuzmichuk, oh, we were losing you there for a moment. You seem to come back. Go ahead.
And so, again, I take serious issue with the fact that this is something that was brought up at Industry Committee before the Christmas break. And Mr. Perkins tried as hard as he possibly could, to get this through. And it was dangerous then, and it is dangerous now. And so to me, it's a matter of principle. And the fact that he failed at Industry to get this through. And so now he's knocking on another door and seeing that if he can get it through this committee, he wants to try a different door, see if he can get this through another committee, and use this committee as well to basically try to undermine and diminish the Honda announcement and the $50 billion of announcement by trying to raise this issue. And I would say that it is absolutely important for us to reject that here, to put a stop to this here, to end this circus here is what I want to see, because these are real jobs that are impacted. These are real jobs that are impacted in my community. And this is something that we absolutely, I can tell you that this is something that our Prime Minister has stated directly is meeting with the CBTU, is having those important conversations. We are having those conversations with Nexstar. We are pushing to maximize local workers wherever possible. But the facts speak for themselves in Windsor. 2,000 Canadian local workers building that battery plant as we speak. 70 Korean workers helping out to make sure that we transfer that knowledge, to train our workers, to make sure that the plant is up and running as quickly as possible, so that 2,500 local Canadian unionized workers can begin building batteries for the North America market for generations to come. This matters. This is serious, because I've lived in a community where we've seen 11.2% unemployment. You do not want to see 11.2% unemployment in your community. It is soul crushing. It is soul crushing. It is painful to watch when you see factories closing, when you see moms and dads out of work, when you see families ripped apart broken apart because of that, when you see the mental health and the anguish, when you see families separated because mom or dad has to travel for 12 months of the year working in the oil sands, coming back time to time on weekends, and the pressure that puts on families and on kids. When you see businesses in your downtown shuttered, ghost town, when you see your population shrinking because young people are graduating and they're leaving in droves to find work elsewhere. You do not want to see that. I do not want to return to that. Our community has gone through hell. And to see a generational historic investment like the battery plant, the thing we dreamed about, $5 billion investment, 2,500 permanent jobs, 2,000 temporary jobs right now. And to watch the Conservatives playing games with this investment, blowing the circus up on this investment, makes me sick. And it makes me angry. And it makes me frustrated. Because we should not be playing games with people's jobs. And we should not be playing games with the future of communities like ours, like mine, working class communities that have gone through hell in the last 8 years. And I would ask my Conservative colleagues to take that into consideration when they are playing games with what is a generational investment for my community. And that's all I have to say on that issue. And I really hope that my colleague in the NDP, Mr. Bachrach, understands where I'm coming from. And I hope that we can count on his support to put an end to this circus and let us get on with the business of building battery plants and building batteries and building jobs in working class communities like mine. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Kuzmierczak. Next on our list is Ms. Vignola, but I was going to stop at 1:30 for a washroom break. We're at 1:29, but we'll move up for 1 minute. We'll suspend for 3 or 4 minutes to allow everyone to make use of a quick rest.
All right, guys, we are still here. We're just gonna flip to the next piece. We're gonna do this thing. It's a marathon. I'm already into tomorrow's schedule. That's fine. This is so interesting. That was super annoying, though.
All right.
That guy is
studying this motion.
As
To
bad as it
send
gets,
it
and we are skipping
preoccupied
over
with
the
a-
block.
Here,
We're
we would
going
have to wait
into the next piece.
for quite some time
And we are
before we
right
actually
into
got
it.
to studying this motion. As for the main motion, very quickly, just before Christmas in November and December, we talked about it at about 4 or 5 meetings. So we're just repeating ourselves here. And if you're going to think of Groundhog Day, well, obviously spring wasn't in the air. So I think that we should try to come to some agreement and that it shouldn't take 5 meetings. Thank you.
Bachrach.
So, Mr. Chair, we're still on the amendment, correct? I think that this is worthy of a study. And to echo my colleague, Ms. Vignola's comments, OGO is currently preoccupied with other topics. I would love to see us get to a report on the rural postal delivery study we're currently conducting. And we're still waiting for the president of Canada Post to come and share some insights with the committee. So the intention here is to send it off to Indu and have them decide whether they want to conduct a study. And in my view, the best way to go about it would be to invite the relevant ministers, to invite the labor unions, to invite the companies involved, and to find out whether there's a justification for making these contracts public. I do think that that comes with a degree of risk, and as has been mentioned by my colleagues, and at the same time, the questions about Canadian jobs are valid ones, and I think they deserve a thorough airing before the committee. But I would prefer that OGO not become sort of a catch-all for these emerging issues where we sideline the rest of our work to take on stuff that other committees can't fit into their schedule, because of course we have a work plan of our own. And in my view, I believe that it's better suited at Indu, which is why I made the amendment in the first place. So I'm happy to vote on it. I'm not going to speak at length like some of my colleagues have, but this is an important issue, and there are a lot. See, I was just filibustering until my colleague came into the room. I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chair, in the hope that we can get to a vote on this amendment to refer it to the industry committee. And with that, I'll welcome my colleague, Mr. Massey, who lives quite a bit closer to these investments than I do, and I know has been working very hard on this file at the industry committee, and I'm sure he'll have some, like Mr. Perkins, who I understand also migrated over from the industry committee to OGO today. I'm sure both of them will have many sage words. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Bachrach. It's nice to see members from other committees being promoted to a more important committee. I have Mr. Joari on the list, then it's Mr. Perkins. Go ahead, Mr. Joari.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in the spirit of being short and being to the point, number one, I neither support the amendment nor the original motion for a number of reasons. First of all, there were two versions of the original motion was sent to us. I would like at some point to get clarification which one of those are we talking about. But the reason I'm not supporting either of them is the fact that we have two members of Indu sitting here, okay, leaving their committee and coming here trying to move this motion. That tells you that this motion does not have a place in OGO. That's number one, aside from the work that we have. My biggest concern is this. When we try to bring into public the content of contract between Government of Canada and companies who were drafted in confidence and then trying to publicize it while the union and the government and the company is working on finalizing and clarifying some of those and publicizing this. This is nothing but more than media show. As we saw, Mr. Perkins, MP Perkins was out there 3 minutes before during the break and was already passing judgment. Okay, so this is not about protecting jobs. This is not about, getting clarified. This is about getting a 2-minute clip. And I think the clip is done. So I think Conservatives have been successful getting on the clip after what happens on, on Thursday. Historic investment by another amazing auto manufacturer who decided to do that investment in Canada. Okay, and who decided to partner with all levels of government. So when stories like that comes, what the Conservatives have to do, they have to create some type of diversion. And this is another example of it. But aside from all of that, fundamentally, publicizing and asking for document and reviewing it in public or in private, doesn't matter. The content of a contract that was drafted and it was signed in public is wrong. There's negotiation going on, and all three parties are at the table. All three parties, especially the union, has said that they're working on resolving some of the potential areas for areas that they need clarification on. It's ongoing. So pulling that on, again, publicizing this is not the right place. We don't do negotiation. We should never do negotiation in public, especially through the media and all of that. So I'll be opposing the amendment as well as the main motion. As a clarification, if Mr. Chair, you could tell us actually which one of the two version of the motion that Mr. Garnett has put, Mr. James has put, we're looking at, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure, there's just one motion that was sent out. There's two motions on what was emailed out to two separate motions, which was emailed out to the committee. Mr. Genuis stated he was introducing the first one, which is the one that starts with, in regards to recent announcements, ABV batteries, and ends with that information related to the above specific areas not available in the contract. So it was just the one that he tabled. Next on the list, Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be pleased to speak on the amendment to Mr. Genuis's motion, and I was struck by some of the things that MP Kmirchuk said, and he may not have thought we were listening, we were, but I was particularly struck by the fact that he said his community's been through hell the last 8 years. I can understand why on this Liberal government, why his community's been through hell in the last 8 years, and I
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Point of order, Mr. Chair. I don't appreciate Mr. Perkins putting words in my mouth that I did not speak. So if you could take that back, I'd appreciate it, especially on an issue as important as this.
Point of order, Chair. I don't appreciate Mr. Kuzmarchuk not knowing that not appreciating something is not a point of order.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Perkins. Continue, please.
Thank you. So, contrary to what MP Kmirchuk said, Indu is not doing a study on this issue. I don't know why he keeps saying it. Perhaps he was having some challenges with the internet connection when I was speaking earlier to it, when I said that Indu is in the middle of Bill C-27, the government's bill on privacy and artificial intelligence, on doing clause by clause to the 256 amendments that have been proposed, all of them substantive from including the 55 amendments from the broken bill that the government proposed to their own legislation. So there is no ongoing study of this, and it's misleading to say that, even though he heard me say it earlier. And the reason we're here is because this isn't me, this is the union. The union, the Canadian Building Trades Union, saying that this is happening. Not only, let me get into some specifics, since apparently the $50 billion of subsidy, they kind of missed the point, the Liberals, that they should be Canadian jobs if you're going to subsidize. So here's what the union is saying, that LG has instructed GEL and Dejin, they are subcontractors on employment, to use eligible Korean nationals and Mexican nationals that could qualify for a certain work visa on the site, and even told them to seek out refugee claimants in Canada who could perform the work. This is apparently in an effort to keep their costs low. Nexstar is increasingly tapping into two contractors which are using foreign workers to take work originally promised to local contractors. This includes work on multi-million-dollar press line and installing module lines. CBTU has said and told folks that they have lots of proof that foreign workers are performing this unspecialized work, that they have unionized members who are unemployed that could be doing this. In fact, after the Prime Minister met with Nexstar on March 14th, the union actually amped up their hiring of foreign workers after talking to them. So be curious as to what was discussed in that meeting, that they felt after meeting the Prime Minister, they could actually hire more foreign workers for the construction. And there is no pause going on, as was claimed. That's the reason the union wrote this letter. There is no pause. In fact, they've got to the point where they're frustrated. And even after the threat of going to the media, they had yet another meeting, the union did, with management to try and get an MOU, an understanding on not having foreign replacement workers. These are workers, just to be clear, that Canadians can be hired for, that are available for work, but are being replaced by people not from Canada. That's generally known as a foreign person coming in to replace workers in Canada, a foreign replacement worker. And that is what's happening by this plant. The government's clearly, if they believe they have the contract, says that they can only hire Canadians or a limited number. I can tell you, at one point, Nexstar said they were going to hire 600 full-time foreign replacement workers in the running of the plant, and Nexstar also said they would have up to 1,000 foreign replacement workers. That was in the media. They changed their tune once they started to get public pressure by this committee and others. So the issue is that this is a real issue. It's not something that the government says Conservatives are making up. This is the letter from the union. Perhaps they didn't hear it. I could read it again, Mr. Chair, if just in case some of the members' earpieces weren't working. I'll leave that. But if you don't know this is the Government of Canada's website. Material handler for the plant. Language is needed. Korean. This is the Government of Canada's own website, and it says who can apply. Candidates with or without a valid Canadian work permit. That's on the Government of Canada's website. Nexstar Energy, recognize the logo? A general affairs specialist, hardly some specialized worker from Korea that needs to come here. It's a, let's see, the state of the general affairs specialist. You will be responsible for various aspects of the company's operations, providing administrative and organizational support. Your tasks will be related to the efficient functioning of the office and ensuring smooth and daily operations of the company. Responsibilities, it says here: office management and organization, correspondence handling and mail management, coordination of meetings and events, administrative support for various departments, document management and archiving, managing office supplies and inventory. These are really specialized tools that only Koreans have. Support HR and recruitment and training, building and managing positive relationship with vendors and clients, assisting with travel arrangements for employees, ensuring compliance with safety and company policies, requirements, experience in a similar role or related field, strong organizational and multitasking skills, excellent verbal and written skills. They sound like very specialized, unique things that you can only find in South Korea. Fluency in Korean. Fluency in Korean. But that's not all, Mr. Chair. Another general affairs specialist. Similar types of things. More office management. A separate posting by Nexstar. Korean preferred. Material handler. Asset. Korean. General affairs specialist requires fluency in Korean. Electrode quality engineer. Bilingual in English and Korean. Module production planner, English and Korean proficiency. Quality management systems, global experience preferred. Module production technician, language requirement. Oh, let's read and write in English. Hey, we found one. Cell electrode quality engineer, bilingual in English and Korean. It goes on and on and on. Now, MP Kamirchuk clearly isn't looking at the job sites when he is making this defense of his government, which I understand why he's doing. He's embarrassed. He's embarrassed by the fact that his government didn't think to put the words employ Canadians when they made this commitment. He's embarrassed by the fact that the company has said they're going to hire up to 1,000 construction workers that are from outside the specialists. 1,000. So 600 Canadians, 1,000 foreign workers. I guess it takes 1,000 specialized people to oversee 600 general construction workers. And 500 to 600 permanent workers from Korea out of 2,500. This is not some sort of one or two here. This is a serious issue. This is $15 billion in taxpayer production subsidies in this plant. This is $500 million in construction costs from the taxpayer being paid. If you're going to do business with the Government of Canada and you're going to suck all this government taxpayer money, Volkswagen, Stellantis, Northvolt, Honda, if you're going to take that money, you better be prepared for some public scrutiny. You better be prepared to prove that you're hiring Canadians. And it's beyond me why the NDP does not want clarity on this. The motion at the Industry Committee, by the way, for those of you who don't watch the clock, ended an hour ago. That's why people are here. Ended an hour ago. That motion was only to have the ministers appear. It wasn't to actually have the contract. It wasn't there to have the contract released.
Order, please.
The contract to be released. I'd love to have the union to come.
Yeah.
Then let's have him here.
Mr.
Let's have him here.
Massey, Mr. Perkins.
I have the floor.
Mr. Perkins, please continue.
Why won't you release the contracts? What's wrong with it? Why are you afraid to release the job conditions in the contracts? Because there is no Canadian requirement for Canadian jobs in those contracts. And again, I look around the table. Only one person here at this table has read the contracts, and it isn't anyone on the government side or Mr. Kamirchuk, who's sitting in wherever he's sitting, attending this committee. And it isn't, to be fair, my colleagues, I've read the contracts, and there's no government commitment requirement in that contract. I can tell you what's not in it. I can't tell you what's in it, but I can tell you what's not in it. A commitment that the jobs have to be Canadian. That's why we need to have this done. This is the union saying this stuff is happening. I don't understand why the NDP Liberals don't want to get the clarity of the contracts. Why don't they want to get clarity of the contracts? Release them.
Colleagues, Mr. Perkins, I'm going to interrupt. We're running out of resources, and because of the continual interruption, I'm going to suspend for question period. Clerk is going to contact everyone for a continuation of this meeting after we are suspended.